How does it actually perform? And initially, it wasn't that crash hot, but let me explain why. So my first impressions of the Crane 2S when I opened the box and started pulling everything out was how good everything felt. So kind of weird, I guess, but how good is that new product feel? Now I'm gonna go full nerd mode here. So let's go out shooting and I'll show you what it's capable of while I tell you all about it. I love the fact that Zhiyun has thought not only about how they can improve how the actual gimbal operates, but how to make the experience as easy as possible. So what I'm referring to here is this new flex mount system. And this basically allows us to balance the gimbal perfectly, then quickly take the camera off the gimbal and use it for something else. So we could put it on a tripod or use it handheld, for instance. It also has a 3 1/4-20 screw holes here, so you can actually attach a plate to be able to slap it onto, say, like a tripod. Then once you're finished, you can quickly reattach it and it's ready to go. No need to rebalance it all over again. Just slap it on, bam, ready to go. And as a person who's used gimbals for majority of my commercial work, this is an absolute godsend. And literally the single biggest selling point for this gimbal for me is this. The other super cool part, which I believe is only currently on the Crane 2S, is a vertical mount. So if you've ever tried to shoot vertically on a gimbal, you know how much of a pain it is. You have to buy an L bracket just so you can actually mount the camera on the gimbal itself. But now Zhiyun has thought of this and built this into the tilt arm itself. And this is super handy for anyone who regularly shoots vertical content or needs to switch between horizontal and vertical constantly. And it goes without saying, guys, that you have to rebalance the gimbal when you switch between the vertical mode and the horizontal mode, so just keep that in mind. Now quickly, before I go too much further, before you can actually use this gimbal, you do have to activate it. So you can do this by powering on the gimbal, loading up the ZY Play app, connecting it via Bluetooth and choosing activate. Then just follow the prompts and you'll be ready to go. So in the box, you get all the goodies. You get a tripod mount, riser plate, cables for controlling your actual camera, a lens support, a charger, and 3 batteries, as well as the actual gimbal itself, obviously. Now there are actually 2 ways of using the Crane 2S, which is actually cool. They've given you this option as well. So you can use it like the original Crane 2, where the arm is out the back, or you can actually bring it down and make it that 45-degree angled arm, so I guess you can clear different sorts of cameras. Now to change it over, it is actually quite simple. It's a little bit finicky, but they give you all the tools in the kit to be able to do this. So firstly, make sure the actual gimbal is off before you start doing this, and then lay it down and take out these bolts here. And you basically have to pry out this little plastic cover bit. Now for me, my little plastic cover was actually glued down, so just take it slow and just kind of like jimmy it up and you'll be fine. Now as for getting out the bottom bit, I had a lot more trouble than this than I really thought, but I found that if you actually pry out this little tiny plastic bit at the bottom first, that actually gives you access to those, about to pull out that bottom bit. So pull that out first. Again, use a bit of force, don't use too much, but just kind of take your time, and you'll easy better get it out. And then once you've actually taken that out, then there's all this extra cabling that you have to tuck away. And because you've taken off that little bottom cap, you can't just like zigzag it in there and kind of push it in there. Just make sure that you don't pinch any of the wires when you go to put it back on. So then once you've kind of put it back together, double check that before you start screwing it down. Screw all those screws in just loosely first, and then when it's all aligned, then you can tighten it down and you are ready to go. Now, not having used the original Crane 2, I can't really compare it to the previous model, but having heavily used the DJI Ronin S, this is where I'm going to be drawing my comparisons from, and I think that a lot of people will be in the same boat as me as well. The Crane 2S supposedly is able to get 12 hours of runtime, making the most of those 3 18650 batteries. These batteries are pretty commonly used in the industry and used in most, if not all, of the Zhiyun gimbals, aside from the mobile ones, I'm pretty sure. They are pretty cheap if you do need a second set, but honestly, I was shooting on-off for the first day I got it, and the battery only dropped down to 3 out of 4 bars. So if you're really worried about running out of battery, then I wouldn't really stress too much, because this thing should last you all day. Now, the big draw card of single-handed gimbals is the slim form factor, which makes it easy to pack away and carry around. Now, if you compare it to something like the Crane 3S, the form factor is much, much smaller. And because they've beefed up the motors on the Crane 2S, it can still hold some pretty hefty cameras. My go-to setup for the past 2 years has been the Ronin S with the Canon C200 and the Sigma 18 to 35mm f1.8 lens. And I mean, it did work, but it definitely maxed out the motors on the Ronin S as well as all the adjustments when trying to balance it as well. And this is a big thing that shocked me about the Crane 2S. With the exact same setup that I have on my Ronin S, there's easily like another 20mm of adjustment left over after balancing it, which means that there's still more room to put even bigger setups on this thing. Not that you would want a setup bigger than what I've currently got, because the current setup is enough to basically snap my back in half when I'm using it, but it just shows how powerful the motors are in this gimbal, as well as how much thought's gone into engineering the gimbal itself. And whilst we're on weight, it only weighs about 2 kilograms, which is about 200 grams lighter than the Ronin S, which I mean, like, it might not seem like much, but when I rig it out, it weighs about 4.5, 5 kilograms, so that 200 gram extra makes a huge difference. The new Access lock system is actually really nice to use as well. It does take some time to get used to which way to basically switch it, but after you get the hang of it, it's super quick to lock and unlock the gimbal. It's also a 3-stage locking system as well, so there is fully locked, partially locked, and then unlocked. The middle mode is used to locate those locking pins where you can then lock it down fully to make sure it doesn't go anywhere. And coming from using the Weeble S, the locking system on that would sometimes come undone when carrying it around, but this thing is solid as. Like, I was carrying it around locked for a good portion of the day, and not once did it slip out of being locked, so super duper handy. Now, apparently the screen is also bigger as well, but not having used the original Crane 2, I can't really compare. But having a screen at all makes it super easy to make adjustments on the fly without having to whip out the app every single time you want to do something. This is something I wish the Ronin S definitely had. Right, now with all the nerdy tech stuff out of the way, how does it actually perform? And initially, it wasn't that crash hot, but let me explain why. So the camera that I'm using on it is not your typical setup that most people would use, or that's actually supposed to be used on this kind of gimbal. The Crane 3S was designed specifically to be used with my exact setup that I'm trying to use on the Crane 2S. I found that it bobbed up and down a bit and it just wasn't that smooth. However, when I threw my EOS R on with a 16 to 35mm and then auto-tuned it, these were the results. But getting back to it, having to tweak the settings on gimbals is not that uncommon to me. I mean, the Ronin S was not 100% smooth out of the gate either, and I did have to tweak the settings to get it running smooth with this particular setup. Now, if we compare it side by side with the Ronin S, initially I expected the Ronin S to be a lot smoother, but I was actually very surprised. Both gimbals have a slight wobble whilst holding my C200 setup, but it's so small that a tiny bit of warp stabilizer gets rid of it all and makes the two indistinguishable from each other. The main thing that I found helped when tweaking was the motor power. Now, you'd assume that a big camera would need more power pumping into the motors, right? Crank out the power to high and she'll be right, hey? But I found that leaving the power on low and actually decreasing the motor power gave me better results. But that doesn't really make any sense, right? But think about it this way. When you balance a gimbal perfectly from the get-go, the only thing the motors are realistically doing is just moving that weight around. Like, it's not trying to hold the weight of the camera and stop it from falling. It's simply giving it a bit of a nudge in a certain direction to get it moving. And this is honestly where most problems with gimbals come from. So not having balanced it properly in the first place will always give you problems down the line. Now, most gimbals do have strong enough motors now to counteract not being perfectly balanced, but like, why make your motors work harder than they need to when you can just balance it perfectly? Now, this is kind of all gone over your head and you do need to learn how to balance a gimbal properly. I'll link up here to my video that I've made. It is me balancing it with the Ronin S, but the principles are the same across the board. Now, when shooting, there are 6 different modes to choose from. Pan follow and following are the 2 main ones that I use. Pan follow will lock the tilt and the roll axis and it will just pan, which allows you to go from normal to underslung mode with ease, and you can get some pretty crazy shots. Following unlocks the tilt and the pan axis, but locks the roll axis. So this is where you can tilt the camera up and down by angling the gimbal itself. And this is also the default mode on the Ronin S. So I'm still getting used to this on the Crane 2S. Point of view unlocks all the axes for you, so you can basically pan, tilt, and roll and create some pretty crazy looking shots. almost kind of looks like you are flying an FPV drone. Locking literally does exactly what you think it does. It locks every axis and gives you freedom of movement without actually moving the camera itself. So this is perfect if you're gonna do a hyperlapse. You need to keep the camera pointed in one direction, and then you can kind of just like move around. Vortex mode is that one that everyone loves, where it's like this crazy infinite roll theme, but unfortunately with my C200 setup, the roll mode actually hits on the viewfinder, so I can't actually do it. But on my EOS R, I was able to get a few shots like this, and it worked actually really great. But just make sure you definitely balance the pan motors properly before doing this, or it will put a lot of extra stress on that particular motor. And finally, go mode is your sports mode, where it's super twitchy and allows you to follow those fast moving objects. So it's almost like you're shooting handheld kind of without having to go handheld. But honestly, you really never use this, because if I want gimbal shots, I want them to be nice and smooth. Now, coming from the Ronin S, it is a bit of an adjustment with the different modes from default. I ended up changing the button to be a click hold instead of a hold, so I can quickly switch between the pan follow mode and just the follow mode. Now, as for accessories, you can get a follow focus and a zoom motor to run on this, both which I don't actually have, and they also have a wireless transmission module as well. This basically allows you to set up a director's monitor and have someone watching along whilst you are shooting, or even controlling the camera with that sync mode turned on. Now, as for price, the Zhiyun Crane 2S retails for $599 US or 999 Australian dollars. I'm not sure exactly why we have to pay so much more here in Australia. But comparing to other gimbals in this kind of price range, I think it's actually a really good deal. The Ronin S standard kit is 1,099 Australian dollars, and this can actually support bigger cameras, which is a big plus for me. Not to mention that flex mount system, which allows you to quickly detach and reattach that gimbal quickly. If you did enjoy this review, guys, then consider liking and subscribing. And if you want to find out more or where to buy this, then I'll leave some links down below for you. And as always, stay creative and just be you. See ya. Oh, I can't do that anymore.